The works need to be works of renewal. It's no good just putting back what you had before. So if you're in an office building, it's best if you put it in the raised floor. It's best if you replace your old radiators and central heating with an air conditioning system, because that's an improvement. That can't be classed as repair. If all you're doing is painting the walls, putting a new suspended ceiling in, changing the lighting where there was lighting before, then chances are you are really going to struggle. Project duration, again, really this links in back to the extent of what you're doing to the building, but anything less than 3 months, I would have said, is onto a loser. If you are merging a number of hereditaments, so if you're taking 6 floors of a building and merging them into one as part of the project, so you're taking out things like kitchens on each floor and putting in maybe some showers in the basement, moving the comms room, rearranging the servicing, that helps. It won't be conclusive, but it might give you a better chance. My own building in the West End, we have done exactly that. We started in November. We finished in May. We spent quite a lot of money. I'm not going to tell you exactly how much. And the valuation office have said, no, we're not taking it out. I think that's just spite, because it was me, actually. But we have taken out all of the servicing. We have taken out the floors. We have taken out the ceilings. We have done everything possible to that building. And they're still refusing to take it out of the list. So that's heading off to valuation tribunal as well. So you can see there's some difficulties around deletions, and you need to be careful if you're planning a project and you're going to putting in these numbers into your feasibility. Think again, because you might not get it. Question at the back.
Yes, you mentioned that project duration of 3 months might not get you your deletion. Is there a situation where you can extend? Sorry, thank you. Is there a situation where you can prolong the work so that you're out of rating for an extended period?
Yeah, this is a question that comes up quite often, actually, and clients say, well, if I go slow and I only have one guy with a wheelbarrow on site and, one person doing the painting when it's finished, and I can make it last 3 years instead of 3 months, will I get it taken out? And the answer is no. If you make it that overt, then you're just, onto a loser. But, I mean, there's nothing to stop you running the project at a slower rate than you otherwise would. And as long as you don't make it too obvious what you're up to, then there's a good chance. It really concerns the extent of the works. That's the much more important consideration, is what are you doing to the building? Is it repair or is it renewal? Is it an improvement? Some people say, well, if I stripped it out, there's nothing there to repair, so it must be renewal. But that argument hasn't seemed to have held much water either. Anyway, a couple of examples. And this is sort of slightly blurring the edges a little bit. But on the left, a building owned by Dacorum Borough Council. And that was a case of vandalism. And the locals from Hemel Hempstead got in and had a bit of a rave one night, I think. And a pretty good one by the look of it. And that was the result. So we applied to have that taken out of rating. And lo and behold, as it was a local authority building, we got it. One on the right is owned by LaSalle over at Aylesbury. And that met with some resistance, even though they'd taken the roof off. The argument from the valuation office was, well, you're not improving it, you've just replaced the roof, so that must be repair, so we don't take it out of the list. They did eventually relent. We took them along to the site when it was raining and made sure it was a really horrible day, and we got that one taken out as well. But it just goes to show the different attitudes that you encounter around the country. Generally in the north, we find they're more amenable, and the closer to London you get, the more difficult it is. So if your properties are in the north, well done. If you're in London, bad luck. Right, before I move on to that section, which is about completion notices and what to do with new buildings, there are a couple of points that came up out of this morning's sessions, which I thought I'd just cover now. And one of those related to squatters. And you might just be interested to know, this is quite an old case. Back in the 70s, a group of squatters got into one of the London embassies and decided to set up shop and put locks on the doors and excluded everyone from coming in and had a lovely time enjoying themselves in the embassy. Westminster decided to send them a rate bill because they met the ingredients of rateable occupation. And not surprisingly, I think this was probably funded by public sources. It went all the way up to High Court. And I think it might have actually got to House of Lords as well. And the outcome of the case was that Mr. Tompkins and his merry men were actually liable for the rates. So if you want to take advantage of the 6-week rule with the temporary occupation, this gets around your point quite nicely, get some squatters in and just leave them there for 6 weeks. Notify the council, find out who the ringleader is, and quote Tompkins versus Westminster, and job done. So that's squatters. They can be your friends. The second point was living guardians, and the point came up in relation to council tax. Now, if you have someone living in a property and it is their sole and main residence, then they will normally attract a council tax assessment. And I think it was alluded to that 1 or 2 had been done, and Band H, probably, if there are enough of them in there. Obviously, you can challenge the banding, but you can't challenge the principle. If it is a residence, it is a residence. Now, what we have in rating is something called a composite assessment. So you can have, in the same building, a council tax entry and a rating entry, commercial entry. Okay? So in those scenarios, you will be clobbered for council tax on the guardian bit and empty rates on the remainder. Okay? So you may have got away with it so far. I suspect that you've done rather well. But that's the normal scenario in this sort of case, where you have and typically, a typical example of a composite would be a pub where the owner lives on site. So he's got a flat upstairs, that's got a council tax entry, and the bit downstairs is commercially rated. So it's a normal scenario. But if you are in the council tax bit, you will need to pay your council tax, and the remaining part will attract business rates. Now, preempting our friend at the back, Bob, who's going to ask me about listed buildings, if the building is listed, then obviously the listed part under rating will be rate-free. You just need to make sure that the council tax bit is as big as possible. Okay, that's the golden rule on this. If you can spread them out, make the Hereditament a Band H, because you're only going to pay $2,500 a year in council tax, that will be to your interest.
Wouldn't the council tax need to have planning permission?
Not necessarily. Rating and planning they're not happy bedfellows, really. If you can occupy a building for any purpose, and it will still be rateable.
Secondly, putting a person in a derelict building, who would be liable for the health and safety?
I have no idea.
The tenant or the landlord?
I would have said the landlord would have a duty of care to the tenant to make sure that he's happy and safe. But I'm a rating surveyor, so these things don't really concern me.
Well, when the building is derelict, then there's what's the health and safety aspect?
Well, if the building's derelict, then I would say we invoke the uneconomic to repair argument and get it taken out of the list. But that's the rating surveyor's answer.
Can the council force me, by putting rates on a building and not removing them in such a case, the council is asking me to break the law, the Health and Safety Act?
Quite possibly.
In such a case, what happens?
Now, there is provision in the Act, in the rating statute, that if you are prevented by law from occupying a building, then they can't claim empty rates on it. Okay, so we had a case recently in Basildon where we had substantial asbestos in the building, and a Type 3 survey had been done, holes punched all over the place, and the asbestos was floating around the building. It would be unlawful for the occupier to allow the building to be used. In fact, the council couldn't allow it to be used under health and safety, and therefore it fell outside the empty rate legislation. So it was exempted. So there's another. If you've got asbestos in your building, punch a whole load of holes in it, let it all fly around inside, and then invoke health and safety.
What about removing the fire escape?
That's a repair, so it wouldn't work. That's been tried a few times. It's de minimis. Anyway, I've got to keep going for 3/4 of an hour, so I'm doing my best. Charitable occupations. Now, I thought Rosemary was going to cover this this morning in a little bit more detail, so I'll just fill you in on one or two aspects. When you've got a charity in occupation, generally the presumption is they will get an 80% discount. Okay, the last 20% is discretionary on the part of the council, comes out of their funds, so you don't generally get that extra benefit. Okay, now for them to give the exemption, the building needs to be used for charitable purposes. It's no good just letting it to a charity and leaving it empty. There needs to be actually some use of the building. If it's empty, the only way that it will be exempted is if you can prove that the next occupier is also a charity. So that's almost impossible to do, I would have said. So that's why the government have constructed the clause in that way, to prevent them having to give away lots of money. Okay, so it needs to be wholly or mainly used for charitable purposes. Now, an example of a shop which you have let to Oxfam or someone like that, at least 50% of the goods that they sell will need to be donated. That's been through the courts. So just putting a charity in doesn't automatically qualify you. And local authorities are wising up to this. I've had a recent case with a client where the building authority has refused to give it, and they've had to take legal advice on that point. So don't assume that you're going to get the benefit of that 80%. Multiple occupations, we talked about workspace this morning as well. Sorry, my voice is making your PA crackle slightly. We talked about workspace. Now, if you are arranging a building into a number of small units so that you can put people in, that's fine. Just bear in mind that if you have an assessment below the 2,600 limit, you will pay no empty rates at all if it's out of use for more than 3 months. So that's well worth bearing in mind. It comes back to this point of overt occupation again. Split it down into little chunks. Just make sure that in small chunks it's not going to cost you more than it will do in one big chunk. And there are some benefits to be had, particularly if you think you're going to get lots of voids. Serviced office and serviced workshop people do this all the time. And generally, when we do the split, we take out the areas of circulation. So you might end up with the value going up by 10% on a unit basis, but 10% of the area comes out, so you stay level pegged. But you can then get the benefit of all these lovely 3-month void periods, or the exemptions, or both. The other thing that came up this morning was oversupply and the to-let boards. And we are running appeals in a number of town centres for oversupply on offices and oversupply on shops. And we've already had success on oversupply in distribution warehouses. Quite substantial numbers on those. So another area for you to consider if you are located in an area where there are lots of vacant properties, and I'm talking here probably in excess of 15% of the stock available in that area. So, if you've got 1 million square feet of built-out space and 150,000 square feet is empty, then you've probably got grounds to start thinking about an oversupply appeal. And that will save you some money, potentially, as long as that oversupply situation continues. Right. Now, let's assume you've gone down the route of refurbing your building. It's come out of the rating list. It's now ready to go back in. What are the processes there? And this is a little slide just to show you what happens when a building comes back in, the process that's actually followed. And these are the circumstances in which it will come back in. It's actually occupied, a valid completion notice has been served by the building authority, or, as an alternative, it's fully complete and capable of occupation. The completion notice served by the building authority deems the building to be complete on a specified date, even if it isn't. Okay? So don't get the impression that you can carry on with your project and then stop, because the building authority have thought of that one. They have got powers to deem the building to be complete on a day within 3 months of the service of the notice. Now, the practical effect of that is that the clock starts ticking. So the building is complete, let's say, in November, and 3 months after that, once the void period has expired, you will start to move on to the empty rate regime at 100%. So there's a nasty sort of sting in the tail to this scenario. This goes back a long way into the mid-60s, been updated. I won't dwell on this too much because it's of limited interest. It has to be served in a particular way, so if you get one of these, well worth taking professional advice. All of those things must be fulfilled. It's got to be in writing, it can't be by email. It's got to be served on the person who is actually able to possess the building. Okay, so that's quite important. Not served on the contractor, for instance. It's got to identify the building properly, must specify the completion day and cannot be retrospective. You can appeal in writing, but you've got to be quick. 28 days from date of receipt. Okay, and it will be a signed for document when it arrives on site or at your offices. You'll get an acknowledgement and you've got to toddle off to the valuation tribunal. And if you're not happy with the result there, you can go off to the county court. Various cases on this point concerning office buildings mainly through the years, and where building authorities have failed to serve completion notices, the courts have held that the money cannot be claimed, and the case fails. Now, just interestingly on this one, this was the first major case on completion notices. Building put up in the 1960s and let to Hines of the 57 varieties. The building was open from window to window and wall to wall and wholly devoid of any internal partitioning. They're also lacking any electrical fittings whatsoever. Position regards electricity was that a 13-amp power point was provided around the external walls at 10-foot centres. This is in the days before computers and anything else. Quill pens by the sound of it. Anyway, that case was dismissed. We move on to 14-storey office building in Stratford, which is still there. And in fact, we've just taken it out on uneconomic to repair grounds. So the whole thing has gone full cycle. There was a case in 75 when it was put up. And what they decided there was that it was only complete for the purposes of actually billing if it was ready for occupation. And the judge, interestingly, said, there is no petitioning in here. So this isn't complete. The post office got into trouble in Nottingham when they didn't have any wiring in, strangely, no phones. And they argued that a newly erected building wasn't complete when furniture and equipment for actual occupation weren't there. The judge said, we don't like that. You're not having that one. That was thrown out. Sandwell District Council. Now, who would be silly enough to build an office building in Sandwell? Well, JGL Investments were, and it took them a long time to find a tenant. In fact, over 2 years. And they claimed at that time should be taken into account. Judge said, on your bike. We then got through to Grey Law in Ipswich, and the law sharpened up a little bit because developers were leaving buildings in a state just shy of where they could be put into the completion notice procedure. So the government moved the goalposts again, and we came up with this concept of substantial completion, which is basically a state when the building is in a shell and core state, and there's a time for a work which would customarily be done to the building. So in normal fitting out work. Add the two together, that gives you a completion date, and away you go. We can finally get to Trendworthy 2 and London Merchant Securities. Great names, these cases. Fantastic reading. And that really embodied that whole substantial completion notion and put it into statute. And there it is, the paragraph 9 of Schedule 4A of the Act. Implications of that? Stop well before substantial completion. There's a good example. Okay? That will not be capable of being rated. So, just to finally finish off, a few thoughts for the future. Where are we heading? Well, Scotland. Anyone got properties in Scotland? One at the back. Our friend there. Scotland at the moment pay 50%. The proposal is that they will move to 90%. Okay, so that's not going to quite put them into the same scheme as we have south of the border and in Wales, but they're getting pretty close. Obviously, the same fiscal pressures that we have down here, and I think that's likely to happen in the not-too-distant future. There have been some mutterings in Westminster about new developments, and the current regime really penalises developers who want to build new space because they think, well, if I don't get this away, I'm going to be subject to the completion notice procedure, and then I'm going to be left holding the baby and the bathwater with a nice big empty rate bill. So there have been mutterings about allowing an amnesty on new build and refurbs. It's been mentioned 6 months, 9 months. I don't know what the latest thinking is, but that's certainly in the mix. And after pressure from the Estates Gazette and others, a working group has been set up to review the current empty rate situation. Throw Mary Portas into the mix as well. She had a couple of ideas, not very good ones. And we're waiting to see what's happening with that. But I don't expect there to be much change in the current rate year. If anything happens, it will be at the budget and will affect 2013-14. That brings me... Oh, I've gone over time.
Perfect. Bonus minutes.
To the end. Thank you.
Yeah. We do the questions instantly because, yeah.
Mark, this is a question I mentioned earlier about a client of mine who's got a listed property in Bristol, and the council rating office have said rateable value is £42,000, and there's no point letting you put guardians in the property. It's going to cost us £42,000. We intend to occupy the ground floor, which is the area most at risk, and the upstairs will remain vacant.
Okay, what you need to do in that particular case is to serve a proposal or ask the valuation office to issue a notice dividing the assessment between the council tax element and the remainder of the building. And you will then have what we call a composite hereditament. You pay council tax on the council tax bit, and as it's a listed building, then you will pay nothing on the remainder. That's... No, it's completely exempt. Yeah. So that's the other route to go down. If you think your building's got architectural merit, get it listed. And if you're not going to get a tenant in the next 2 or 3 years, we can help you with that. I've got an expert in my firm who's good at getting those things listed. So that's my little advert for the afternoon. Any others?
Can you give me a personal view on on charities with Bluetooth technology taking over assessments, claiming their relief? Hopefully the landlord or the property owner will be able to offload that by the existence of a tenancy without any later date, perhaps a bill appearing from the local authority.
Well, this comes down to a question of occupation. What constitutes occupation? And as you know, in rating law, there has to be 4 ingredients. It doesn't have to be too transient. Well, obviously, if it's stuck there on the wall, it's not going to be too transient. It has to be actual occupation. There has to be a benefit. Well, that's potentially fulfilled. And it has to be exclusive. So you have to have one person in the building. Now, I think the question here is putting a box on the wall and transmitting some Bluetooth waves around you actually occupation? I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. Some local authorities might accept it, particularly if there's a charity involved, and they're feeling, friendly towards them. Others, I wouldn't try it in Milton Keynes because you're not going to get away with it there, or Sheffield. Others will be less sympathetic. So it's a question of try it. If it doesn't work, it's not going to cost you much, is it? So it's much better to actually get the charity to put some old computers in the building or some books or some furniture, and they can actually see then that the proper use is being made.
Okay. Final question?
Transitional relief used to be a major problem with taking properties out of rating and putting them back in again.
Yep.
Lots of it. Is that still a factor?
Yes. Yeah, there's a question about, which has arisen recently. The Valuation Office have been very reluctant to actually delete properties completely, because they say if take my office for instance, which has undergone quite an extensive refurbishment, the building's still there, the hereditament still exists, but it has no value, or they say it has value, I say it doesn't have any value. If they agree with me, they will take it to nil. Now, when it comes back in, or when they put the value back up, we were scratching our heads wondering, actually, are we going to lose our transition on this? Is it all going to be top sliced? Because it's in the West End and it's going to up 100% between the lists. And the advice we've had is that, no, you won't. So if that answers your question. Now, the other point to bear in mind on transition is that a lot of properties, particularly old, nasty ones, will be in downwards transition. And the only way you can save any money on those is to alter the 2005 list entry. Now, obviously, the list is shut, and you can't appeal it, but you can get a certificate, and that will do the trick. It may, in some cases, be completely pointless to appeal the 2010 list figure because it will make no difference to what you pay at all. But if you adjust the 2005, you're adjusting the starting point for the transition, and that will give you a benefit. So that's worth bearing in mind, particularly on oversupply cases. So whenever you settle an appeal, from 1st of April, always think, actually, have I got a case for 31st March, the day before the last day of the old list? And that's well worth having a look at.